In the long stretch of European history that unfolded between the collapse of Roman infrastructure and the gradual emergence of early modern towns, the idea of cleanliness took on meanings that were far stranger, more symbolic, and far more contradictory than most people today would expect. When we imagine medieval life, we often picture muddy streets, heavy cloaks, and a general absence of anything resembling personal hygiene. Yet the truth was neither simple nor straightforward. Bathing existed, disappeared, returned, and then became feared again. Water itself was both trusted and distrusted. Bathhouses were places of refreshment, suspicion, sin, and medical theory, all mixing together in a slow, drifting narrative of belief and misunderstanding. And so the story of medieval bathing becomes a quiet window into how societies change their understanding of something as basic as washing the human body. For many centuries after the fall of Rome, public bathing facilities struggled to survive. The Romans had built enormous complexes with heated floors, flowing water, and elaborate systems meant to keep large populations clean and socially connected. But as those structures crumbled and the engineering knowledge faded, early medieval communities had neither the resources nor the administrative structures to maintain anything similar. People did still wash, but washing became a personal act rather than a civic one. Without the old bathhouses, the meaning of cleanliness shifted from public to private, and slowly the practice of immersing oneself in water became something that belonged to small homes, wooden tubs, and occasional warm springs. What had once been a normal communal ritual changed into an irregular personal decision shaped by whatever beliefs prevailed at the time. By the 12th and 13th centuries, though, especially in growing towns across Germany, France, and the Low Countries, public bathhouses returned. These establishments were simple but popular. They often stood near rivers or natural springs, operated with heated water, and provided tubs, benches, and steam rooms. People visited them not only to wash, but also to eat, drink, rest, and socialize. For a brief period, the medieval bathhouse almost resembled an informal community center. Men and women bathed together in certain regions, though sometimes separated by wooden partitions that were not particularly effective. Bath attendants helped wash backs, clean hair, and provide simple oils. The experience was less luxurious than the Roman model. By the 15th and 16th centuries, European bathhouses declined rapidly. Many were shut down by city councils. Others decayed quietly as customers disappeared. What once had been a lively social landscape shrank into memory. Medieval communities adapted by replacing immersion with dry methods of cleanliness. People changed linen frequently, believing that the cloth absorbed impurities from the skin. They used rough cloths to rub away dirt rather than water. Physicians recommended perfumes and aromatic powders to purify the body. Water, which had once symbolized purity, now symbolized risk. Yet even as public bathing faded, private bathing did not disappear completely. Wealthy households kept small tubs, heated water, and practiced washing behind closed doors. Noble women maintained ritual baths after childbirth. Travelers wrote of inns that still kept washing rooms. But these practices became exceptions rather than the norm. Throughout much of Europe, an atmosphere of unease surrounded the simple act of stepping into warm water. The body and the world were thought to interact too unpredictably for people to trust a practice that opened the pores and stirred the humors. Still, medieval bathing customs were far from uniform. Some regions, especially in Scandinavia and the eastern parts of Europe, preserved steam bath traditions that resembled the ancient sauna. In these places, the cultural meaning of heat and water was different. Steam was considered protective and cleansing rather than dangerous. Bathing in these environments persisted without the moral weight that burdened Western European bathhouses. The contrast between regions revealed how flexible and context-dependent medieval ideas about cleanliness could be. And so, across the centuries, bathing in the Middle Ages became a symbol of the complex interactions between health, sin, fear, and tradition. Sometimes it was embraced as a source of well-being. Sometimes it was rejected as a pathway to physical or moral danger. Sometimes it thrived as a business. Sometimes it vanished under pressure from plague or doctrine. Through it all, water remained essential yet suspicious, comforting yet feared, necessary yet avoided. The medieval world held contradictory ideas simultaneously, drifting between them without urgency. In this quiet, slow-moving story, bathhouses become more than buildings. They become reflections of how societies understand their bodies, their health, and their spiritual lives. As the Middle Ages continued to unfold, the uncertainty surrounding bathing only deepened, shaped by layers of medical theory, religious interpretation, and simple everyday habit. People no longer agreed on whether water healed or harmed, whether warm baths strengthened the body or weakened it, whether steam cleared the humors or stirred them into imbalance. And because medieval life moved at a slow, steady pace, such debates did not resolve quickly. They simply lingered, shaping the rhythm of life in small towns, monasteries, and manor houses. Monastic communities, for instance, held their own complex relationship with bathing. Early monastic rules allowed occasional washing, especially for health or necessity, but discouraged anything that resembled luxury or pleasure. For monks and nuns, bathing was an act that needed justification. It had to serve a spiritual purpose or protect one from illness. The body was considered a vessel that required discipline more than comfort. Yet even within these strict communities, bathhouses existed in some abbeys, particularly in wealthier or more influential monasteries. They were simple structures, heated by fire, with wooden benches and small tubs. Monks used them cautiously, often in silence, and seldom with any ornamentation. Cleanliness was associated with humility, not indulgence. In towns and villages, people developed practical routines tailored to their circumstances. Some washed by collecting heated water in ceramic basins. Others went to rivers at dawn, especially in summer when the cold air was less harsh. Parents washed their children more frequently than they washed themselves, believing that young bodies absorbed impurities more easily. Travelers washed at inns only when necessary, often complaining that the water was cold, the tub small, or the rooms drafty. Washing was less a ritual than an irregular reaction to dirt, heat, sweat, or illness. There was no consistent rule, only a collection of habits shaped by experience and belief. Medical writers of the medieval period contributed to the confusion with treatises that blended observation with humoral theory. They wrote that warm baths could relax the muscles, soften the skin, and open the pores. They also argued that excessive bathing could weaken the body, disturb the balance of humors, or stir melancholy. Physicians recommended baths for certain conditions and warned against them for others. A bath could be a treatment for fever, or it could cause one. It could soothe the mind, or it could excite the passions. The same practice could cure and harm depending on who interpreted it. And so people followed advice selectively, shaping personal routines around fragments of medical opinion. The growing presence of bathhouses in medieval towns created social spaces that attracted both admiration and distrust. On market days, bathhouses filled quickly. Customers paid small fees to enter, ordered warm meals and relaxed in heated water while listening to conversations around them. Some bathhouses had attendants who poured warm water from wooden buckets, scraped the skin gently, or helped rinse away soap made from animal fat and ash. These attendants were not physicians, but they served essential roles in medieval hygiene. People trusted them more than they trusted medical theory. But as the medieval period progressed, the bathhouse became entangled with moral suspicion. Religious writers argued that the mixture of men and women, the presence of food and wine, and the ease of bodily relaxation encouraged sin. They described bathhouses as places where temptation found opportunity, and where the line between necessity and indulgence blurred dangerously. City councils responded with regulations. Some imposed gender separation. Others restricted hours or required special supervision. In some regions, bathhouses were forced to post signs warning customers against immoral behavior. These measures reflected not only moral anxiety, but also a desire to control public spaces in growing urban environments. The arrival of plague changed everything once more. The medical belief that warm water opened the pores and allowed disease to enter made people fearful of activities that had once brought comfort. Bathhouses emptied. Wooden structures decayed. Many were demolished outright during outbreaks to prevent gatherings. Physicians recommended dry hygiene, wiping the skin with cloth, brushing the hair, and applying aromatic powders. People wore small bags of herbs around their necks, believing that pleasant smells repelled corrupted air. They changed linen more frequently, convinced that the cloth pulled impurities from the skin. The fabric became a substitute for water, and cleanliness became something achieved through friction rather than immersion. In this new understanding, water was not simply risky, it was unpredictable, capable of altering the body's internal balance in ways that people could not easily explain. When the weather was cold, hot water shocked the system. When the weather was warm, cold water caused chills. And at all times, water seemed capable of moving humerus too quickly or too slowly. Medieval medical theory described the body as a delicate vessel, influenced by every shift in temperature, air, diet, and activity. Bathing became yet another variable that required careful management. Still, the medieval relationship with water was not entirely negative. People continued to visit natural springs believed to hold healing properties. Pilgrims traveled to remote valleys, mountainsides, and caves where mineral waters flowed. These springs were associated with saints, miracles, and ancient traditions. Pilgrims bathed to heal injuries, soothe aches, or seek relief from chronic conditions. Unlike the urban bathhouse, the holy spring carried no moral suspicion. Its water was sacred rather than indulgent. In these places, people washed quietly, guided by a mixture of faith and hope. The decline of bathhouses also changed the social rhythms of medieval towns. Without communal bathing, people lost a space that had once brought them together. Conversations moved to taverns, market stalls, and churches. Bathhouse attendants found new occupations. Soap makers shifted to producing scented powders and perfumed cloth. The absence of public baths created a gradual shift in how people interacted with one another, yet the change happened so slowly that few remarked upon it. Medieval life adapted without urgency, evolving through quiet adjustments rather than abrupt transformations. All the while, the fear of water lingered. People whispered that bathing before a journey weakened travelers. Washing during storms invited illness. Immersing the body during winter risked chills that could be fatal. These beliefs, shaped by centuries of mixed experience and unclear logic,
became ordinary parts of daily life. They persisted not because they were proven, but because they felt familiar. In a world where thickness could strike without warning, caution seemed wiser than curiosity. Thus, medieval cleanliness emerged not from water, but from cloth, scent, ritual, and habit. People managed their bodies in ways that made sense to them, guided by tradition and shaped by uncertainty. Bathhouses faded into the background, remembered more for their controversies than their comforts, and in their place grew a quieter, more private approach to hygiene, one that relied on touch rather than immersion, dryness rather than wetness, linen rather than water.
As medieval society settled into its long, steady rhythm, the meaning of water continued to drift in subtle and sometimes contradictory directions. Although the fear of bathing had grown, water itself remained central to daily life. It powered mills, nourished crops, and shaped the geography of towns and villages. Rivers marked boundaries, provided fish, and carried small boats. People lived near water even as they hesitated to immerse themselves in it. This quiet paradox shaped everyday decisions, creating a world where water was watched, used, respected, and feared all at once. Most medieval households kept wooden buckets for carrying water from wells or rivers. Drawing water took effort, and so people used it sparingly. They drank beer or diluted wine more often than plain water because fermentation was believed to purify liquids. For washing small parts of the body, hands, face, or feet, people poured water into ceramic basins. This kind of limited washing did not carry the same dangers as full immersion because it did not heat the body or open the pores. It was practical and safe. When guests arrived, hosts offered water for hand washing as a gesture of courtesy. The gesture was symbolic as much as hygienic, reinforcing social norms rather than promoting physical cleanliness. The avoidance of full-body bathing became even more widespread during the late medieval period, but it did not eliminate the desire for cleanliness altogether. People sought other methods to maintain comfort. Many Europeans wore layers of linen beneath their outer garments. Linen was believed to absorb sweat, oils, and impurities. Changing linen regularly became a key marker of personal hygiene. Wealthier households employed servants to wash and beat the linen, removing dirt through friction rather than immersion of the body. This indirect approach to cleanliness shaped fashion itself. Linen shirts, chemises, and undergarments became essential not for warmth, but for purification. The smell of medieval life was managed through scents rather than soap. Herbs hung from rafters. Perfume sachets were tucked into sleeves, pockets, and belts. People burned aromatic wood, scattered dried flowers on floors, and used scented oils lightly on the skin. These practices created an atmosphere not of sterility, but of familiar smells that masked unpleasant odors. Medieval people did not expect bodies to be scentless. Instead, they aimed for a natural smell, softened by herbs. The idea of a body that must smell like nothing at all had not yet emerged. As for the fear of bathhouses, it became intertwined with larger concerns about morality and disease. In towns where bathhouses survived longer, their atmosphere changed dramatically. Instead of lively gatherings filled with families and merchants, bathhouses became places visited cautiously, often by specific professions such as soldiers, travelers, or laborers. They were no longer symbols of community, but remnants of an older world. Some bathhouses adapted by advertising medical treatment. They claimed to offer therapeutic baths using herbs, mineral salts, or steam. These establishments survived by presenting themselves not as places of pleasure, but as places of controlled healing. Their existence demonstrated how medieval people negotiated between fear and necessity. The religious dimension of bathing also evolved.
Christian theologians discussed cleanliness in terms of the soul rather than the body. Cleanliness was associated with purity of heart, humility, and confession. Many religious writings compared spiritual cleansing with water metaphorically, while simultaneously warning against literal indulgence in baths. Water symbolized redemption in baptism, yet excessive bathing symbolized vanity. This tension remained unresolved for centuries. It shaped how people interpreted health, danger, and moral behavior without providing clear guidance. In many villages, the lack of access to bathhouses or clean, warm water made large-scale bathing rare simply out of practicality. People washed in rivers only during warm months, and even then cautiously. The water was often cold, muddy, and difficult to enter safely. Accidents occurred, especially during spring floods. As a result, bathing in natural water became an occasional event rather than a routine. It was often tied to work. Fishermen, millers, and washerwomen had more contact with water than others, simply because their professions required it. For most people, water for washing was something fetched in buckets and used sparingly. Medieval medical theory continued to reinforce caution regarding bathing. Physicians wrote treatises describing how water affected different temperaments. People believed that each person had a natural balance of humus, hot, cold, dry, and moist, and that bathing disturbed this balance. A bath taken at the wrong time of year could cause headaches. A bath taken after eating could weaken digestion. A bath taken after strenuous work could cause fevers. These guidelines made bathing a highly regulated act. Instead of being a routine part of life, it became something that required careful timing and consideration. Yet despite these veers, bathing never entirely disappeared from medieval awareness. Travelers' diaries occasionally mentioned inns that offered small baths. Nobles maintained private bathing chambers that resembled simple wooden rooms with heated tubs. Illustrations in medieval manuscripts depicted kings bathing, surrounded by attendants pouring warm water. Bathing was not absent, it was simply selective, restricted, and shaped by caution. The wealthy washed more frequently than the poor, not because they understood cleanliness better, but because they had the resources to manage the risks as they perceived them. In household, children were washed more often than adults. Mothers believed that young bodies require more attention because they were more delicate. Infants were bathed in warm water as part of weekly routines. The contrast between the frequent washing of children and the infrequent washing of adults revealed how medieval beliefs differentiated between bodies based on vulnerability. Adults, considered stronger, were thought capable of managing impurity through diet, exercise, and clothing. Children required more dialect care. Seasonal rhythms also shaped medieval bathing habits. In summer, limited bathing occurred because the weather made water less dangerous. In winter, almost ceased altogether. The cold air discouraged immersion, and heated water required significant labor and fuel. Many households simply did not desire the effort to heat water, which was perceived as risky. People adopted by focusing on dry methods, brushing hair, changing linen, rubbing the skin with cloth, and occasionally washing hands and faces with slightly warmed water. These practices created an atmosphere not of sterility, but of familiar smells that masked unpleasant odors. Medieval people did not expect bodies to be scentless. Instead, they aimed for a natural smell softened by herbs. The idea of a body that must smell like nothing at all had not yet emerged. By their late Middle Ages, the combined effects of disease, moral anxiety, and practical obstacles had reshaped medieval attitudes toward bathing into something vastly different from earlier centuries. Water was a tool, but not a comfort. Cleanliness was an aspiration, but not an expectation. People maintained their bodies quietly, cautiously, and with a sense of routine shaped by caution rather than pleasure. The story moved forward slowly, shaped by belief, habit, and the uncertain logic of a world where illness and morality were never far apart.
As the medieval world moved into its later centuries, the gradual shift away from communal bathing became more deeply woven into the social fabric of daily life. People no longer remembered the Roman bathhouses except as distant stories or ruins. The few medieval bathhouses that survived seemed like oddities, half medical, half social, and never fully trusted. Over time, water itself came to occupy a symbolic space in the medieval imagination, tied not only to health and danger, but also to identity, class, belief, and the rhythms of work. In rural communities, where most Europeans lived, bathing was limited not only by fear, but also by practicality. Villages typically centered around a small church, a well, and a scattering of wooden homes. Heating water in such households required chopping wood, carrying water, and waiting for long periods. The entire process was time-consuming and rarely considered worth the effort for regular washing. Instead, washing was reserved for particular moments, after illness, before certain religious celebrations, or during preparations for childbirth. These occasions gave bathing a ritual significance, transforming it from a casual act into something deliberate and meaningful. Water also carried a sense of the unpredictable. Rivers flooded without warning, wells dried up during harsh summers, and storms brought lightning that frightened people. Because water could shift so dramatically between being a life-giving resource and a source of destruction, it became easy to associate bathing with vulnerability. If the natural world changed suddenly, why should the human body not react just as unpredictably when submerged in water? This way of thinking was subtle but persistent. In many parts of Europe, religious festivals incorporated water in symbolic ways that did not involve bathing. Holy water sprinkled at church entrances served as spiritual purification. Blessings of rivers or wells on feast days reinforced the idea that water was powerful, but the power was something to be handled with caution. Pilgrims carried small vials of sacred water from famous shrines, believing in its protective qualities. Yet these same pilgrims might avoid a warm bath for fear of opening their pores to illness. The distinction between sacred and ordinary water grew sharper, reflecting a worldview shaped more by symbolism than physical understanding. Within towns, the decline of public bathhouses changed urban life in subtle ways. Markets remained crowded, but the absence of central bathing spaces reduced opportunities for shared relaxation. Instead, people gathered in taverns, guild halls, and churchyards. These were dry spaces, shaped by conversation rather than immersion. As laughter and stories shifted into these new environments, medieval social life adapted quietly. The sounds of splashing water, warm steam, and friendly chatter that once filled bathhouses faded from memory. In their place, people became more accustomed to living with constant layers of clothing, perfumes, and the natural odors of daily work. The medical literature of the period continued to guide this transformation. Physicians wrote long lists of instructions detailing when a bath might be safe. They advised bathing only in moderate weather, after careful diet, and never after heavy labor. They suggested adding herbs like chamomile, sage, or rosemary to water to balance humors. Their recommendations were specific yet contradictory, making the act of bathing feel more like a calculated medical procedure than a routine part of life. For many, this complexity served as another reason to avoid immersion altogether. Despite the general caution, there were still communities that held on to older traditions. In some alpine regions, for instance, people went to natural hot springs during winter to relieve joint pain. These springs, heated by volcanic or geological activity, offered water that remained warm regardless of the season. Here, bathing was not tied to luxury, but to survival in cold climates. Travelers wrote brief accounts of such places, describing simple bathing huts built near rising steam. Yet these stories remained regional and did not reshape broader European beliefs. Another element influencing medieval bathing practices was the growing importance of clothing. Fashion expanded rapidly across the later Middle Ages, with people layering garments of wool, linen, and sometimes silk. Clothing became a way to manage temperature, preserve modesty, and avoid direct exposure to water. Outer garments were seldom washed because washing wool risked ruining the fabric. Instead, people relied on the idea that linen undergarments absorbed sweat and impurities, and changing these garments regularly was seen as a form of bodily maintenance. This practice provided a sense of cleanliness without the perceived risks associated with bathing. In wealthier households, bathing became a controlled luxury. Noble families kept wooden tubs lined with cloth to prevent splinters. Servants brought warmed water in buckets and filled the tub slowly. Herbs and flowers were added for scent. The process was lengthy and labor-intensive, which made it inherently exclusive. Bathing in such environments was more acceptable because it was private, supervised, and believed to be safer than public bathhouses. Even so, nobles bathed infrequently compared to modern standards. Weekly or monthly bathing was considered more than enough to maintain health. The perception of water continued to evolve as Europe faced recurring outbreaks of disease. Plague, smallpox, fevers, and respiratory illnesses circulated regularly. When people witnessed sudden outbreaks following periods of warm weather, they reinforced their belief that bathing, which warmed the body, made one vulnerable to sickness. These associations were not grounded in scientific understanding, but they felt logical within the worldview of the time. In addition, the fear of water influenced medieval architecture. Many homes lacked built-in bathing spaces. Instead, rooms were designed for warmth and storage rather than washing. Hearths for cooking doubled as heating sources, but they were not adapted for heating large amounts of bathing water. This practicality further discouraged regular immersion. Washing became a mobile activity that required setting up temporary arrangements rather than relying on permanent spaces. Such practical constraints blended seamlessly with existing fears, creating a stable cultural pattern. As the medieval period moved toward its close, the idea of bathing was no longer something people asked about regularly. It had become a background concern, something addressed occasionally, but not central to life. When people became ill, they sought remedies involving herbs, diet, rest, and prayer. When they felt dirty, they changed linen or wiped the skin with cloth. When they wished to feel refined or presentable, they used scents. In all these small adjustments, medieval people constructed an entire system of hygiene without truly relying on water. And yet, despite all this, bathing never disappeared entirely. It survived at the edges of medieval life, within monasteries under strict rules, in noble households under supervision, at holy springs with spiritual significance, and in northern regions where steam bathing remained ingrained. These pockets of continuity demonstrated that medieval beliefs were not uniform. Rather, they reflected a world where caution and tradition intertwined slowly, shaping behavior not through strict rules, but through gradual shifts in perspective. By the later Middle Ages, the bathhouses that once echoed with soft conversation and steamy breath had begun to lose their comfortable reputation. A strange mixture of religious anxiety, medical confusion, and growing paranoia swept across towns and villages. People who once visited the warm pools without a second thought now walked past them with lowered eyes, whispering short prayers or warnings to themselves. The bathhouse, once a place of warmth, began to feel like a forbidden doorway, where water and sin mingled in ways the mind could hardly separate. Doctors of the age added to the confusion. They believed the human body opened itself during the bath, not just physically, but spiritually.
A hot bath, they argued, loosened the skin, widened the pores, softened the inner organs, and weakened the natural defenses of the body. If a person stepped outside after bathing, even a small breeze could carry sickness into the lungs, the bloodstream, and the heart. Some physicians claimed that water itself could hold invisible poisons. If the water had touched the wrong stone, or flowed too close to a graveyard, or carried the reflection of a cursed moon, then bathing in it could invite slow, creeping death. People listened because fear always sounds convincing when spoken by someone with a heavy book and a long robe. Religious sermons also grew louder. Priests warned that shared bathing, especially between men and women, tempted the flesh toward forbidden pleasures. The steam rising from the rooms was described in fiery metaphors, as if the warm mist itself was a sign that demons wandered unseen in the air. Bathhouse owners were pressured to close earlier. Some towns demanded that no mixed bathing be allowed. Others banned it entirely, claiming that every drop of water carried not only disease, but moral danger. The fear of sin became so intertwined with the fear of water that no one could tell where one ended and the other began.
But despite the warnings, people could not entirely abandon their desire for warmth. Winter nights were bitter, and many homes were cold and cramped. Poor families had no private ways to wash themselves properly, so the bathhouse remained, for many, the only escape from the endless dirt of daily labor. They entered cautiously, looking around as though stepping into a haunted chapel. They lowered their bodies into the water slowly, half expecting it to sting or whisper or swallow them whole. Some even prayed before dipping a hand into the tub, asking protection from whatever spirits might linger inside the liquid. Merchants who traveled between cities brought their own tales. They spoke of towns where bathhouses were shut because people believed water carried the memories of the dead. They told of villages where residents refused to bathe for months, claiming that angels would protect them from disease as long as they avoided touching water. And yet, even as these stories spread, every traveler also knew that the smell of unwashed bodies made long journeys almost unbearable. Thus, the strange balance continued, fear on one side, necessity on the other. The upper classes invented new habits to avoid the risks. Wealthy women washed their faces with dry cloths scented with herbs. Nobles sprinkled rose water on their clothes instead of bathing. Some believed that perfumes could chase away both odor and illness, though others muttered that strong smells simply covered deeper dangers. Still, the bathhouses in large cities continued working, though usually under strict rules. The sound of buckets, the echo of footsteps on wet stone, and the gentle splash of water remained part of urban life, even if accompanied by the constant tremor of fear. In monasteries, the rules on bathing varied. Some monks bathed only a few times a year, following ancient guidelines. Others believed cleanliness was essential to spiritual discipline. Monks who lived near rivers sometimes built small wooden huts where they could sit on floating benches. But even they argued endlessly about how much bathing was too much bathing. A monk might ask whether washing his feet twice a week was a sign of pride. Another might wonder whether dirty skin pleased God more than clean skin. These debates continued for centuries, quietly shaping the peculiar relationship medieval people had with water. Meanwhile, the bathhouse itself slowly became a symbol of contradiction. It offered comfort, yet inspired fear. It promised cleanliness, yet was accused of causing disease. It brought people together, yet was blamed for moral collapse. Travelers who passed one at night often heard the faint crackle of the furnace and the soft rush of water through pipes. Some described the sound as peaceful. Others compared it to the breathing of something alive, something waiting, something not entirely understood. As the centuries turned and the world stumbled toward new discoveries, many of the old fears remained like stubborn shadows. Generations passed, each inheriting the anxieties of the last, each unsure whether the danger was real or imagined. Even when knowledge improved and doctors learned more about the human body, the memory of medieval dread still whispered beneath the surface of every bath. The idea that water could betray you, tempt you, or weaken you did not disappear easily. And so, in the dim corners of history, the bathhouse stands as a reminder of that strange era, an era when the fear of water shaped daily life, when steam was suspicious, when cleanliness felt dangerous, and when the simple act of bathing carried more mystery, superstition, and caution than we can fully understand today. The doors of those old bathhouses may have rotted away, and their stones may lie cold beneath centuries of dust, but their stories drift onward quietly, like warm vapor rising into a dark medieval night, fading slowly into sleep. The centuries kept turning, softly, slowly, like the pages of a forgotten parchment curling at the edges in a damp monastery library. By the time Europe drifted into the later Middle Ages, people had developed a strange, uneasy relationship with water. The bathhouse was still present in many towns, sometimes large and impressive, sometimes small and almost collapsing under the weight of steam and superstition. But its reputation had begun to fade, little by little, like a mural losing its color in the sun. The fear of invisible dangers, especially the unseen sins that priests described in long sermons, continued to move through society. Water, which once felt almost sacred, now felt suspicious to many. People began to believe that warm water opened the body in a dangerous way, that steam loosened the moral boundaries of the mind, that washing too much was a sign of vanity or greed or a hidden desire to attract unwanted attention. Slowly, these ideas mixed with practical concerns, diseases that seemed to spread with warmth, moral panics that rose whenever rumors traveled from one village to another, and an overall sense that cleanliness might be a temptation instead of a virtue. In many towns, the bathhouses that once echoed with conversation and laughter grew quieter. Some closed completely, their wooden doors locked and their basins empty, slowly filling with dust instead of water. Others remained open but became known more for secrecy than for cleanliness. People visited them at night, quickly, cautiously, as if they were stepping into a place where the walls themselves might whisper complaints to the local priest. The fear of sin shaped the landscape far more than the fear of dirt ever did. Yet, despite all the warnings and all the sermons, there were still those who believed in washing. Pilgrims coming from warmer lands carried the memory of Roman baths or Islamic hammams, places where the act of washing was almost spiritual. Merchants who traveled long roads remembered how water revived them after months of dust and discomfort. Some physicians argued gently that steam could help the lungs, that warm water could ease the joints, that washing was not the enemy. But their voices were not loud enough to change the minds of the majority. At the same time, the belief in certain strange rituals continued. People washed only their hands and faces because that was considered safe, modest, and practical. Many reused the same clothing for months at a time, convinced that the cloth itself absorbed and protected them from the illnesses that might be lurking in the world. The idea of submerging one's whole body in water felt almost unnecessary or even dangerous, and so entire generations lived without ever entering a full bath. The rivers that once served as places of community bathing slowly became places people feared. Dark water was associated with spirits or demons. Murky edges were believed to hide curses left by witches. A cold river at dawn was thought to weaken the heart, while a warm river at midday supposedly invited fevers. Stories like these lingered in the minds of villagers, especially in the cold months when mist rose from the surface like smoke from a cauldron. In some cities, epidemics swept through the population, and people blamed the bathhouses for opening the pores, for inviting disease to slip into the body. They believed that if the skin stayed sealed, unwashed, untouched by water, they would remain safe. And so, in the name of survival, people avoided baths even more. It was a strange mixture of fear, faith, and flawed reasoning, but it shaped an entire era. Monks copied old manuscripts by candlelight, recording thoughts about purity, fasting, discipline, but saying very little about washing. Priests preached about spiritual cleansing and heavenly purity, but rarely spoke about earthly cleanliness. Travelers carried these ideas across borders, and slowly the bathhouse culture that once connected different regions began to fade into memory. Still, behind closed doors, some families continued old traditions. A basin of warm water, hidden away in a quiet room, used late at night when no one was watching. Soft cloths dipped and wrung out. Quiet sighs of relief as the water touched the skin. These small rituals survived in the shadows even when the larger world turned away from bathing altogether. The strange history of fear and water continued like that for decades, one long stretch of time where belief outweighed logic, where superstition shaped daily behavior, and where people walked through life surrounded by worries that modern minds can barely imagine. The bathhouse, which once a common and even joyful part of life, had become a symbol of danger, temptation, and uncertainty. And yet the story was not finished. Another change was coming, slowly, carried by new ideas and new influences from distant worlds. But for now, in this quiet chapter of medieval life, the world slept under the weight of fear, misunderstanding, and a deep, lingering suspicion of the water that once brought comfort. By the closing years of the Middle Ages, a strange quietness settled over the culture of bathing, as if centuries of fear, desire, superstition, and half-believed warnings had finally merged into one slow-moving tradition that people followed without much thought. Bathhouses still operated, but the atmosphere inside had changed. The laughter that once echoed lightly now came only in soft murmurs. The steam felt heavier, the torches flickered with a more solemn light, and the visitors spoke less and listened more, as though waiting for something unseen to reveal itself. People bathed out of necessity rather than pleasure. The joy that once accompanied warm water had faded, replaced by a humble acceptance that bathing was simply another part of life, dangerous or not. The church's voice continued to loom in the background, reminding everyone that excessive comfort was sinful, but the people were too tired to resist and too weary to avoid the baths altogether. The medieval world had grown old, and its fears had grown old with it. Bathmasters now worked quietly. They prepared herbs, warmed the stones, and filled the tubs with slow, steady movements, almost ritualistic. They claimed that certain herbs protected against the sins associated with bathing, though no one truly knew whether it was belief or habit that kept visitors returning. The water, warm and gentle, continued its eternal task of soothing the human body, even as the human mind wrestled with ancient anxieties. Outside, the world was changing. Trade routes expanded, cities grew busier, new ideas drifted in from distant lands. Scholars began questioning old beliefs. Physicians studied disease with new curiosity. Slowly, the fear of water began to weaken, though it did not vanish entirely. It clung to the shadows like an old superstition unwilling to die. Inside the bathhouses, time seemed to move in long, slow circles. A traveler would sit in a corner, soaking in silence, listening to the distant echoes of footsteps in the corridor. A merchant would sigh deeply, letting the warmth undo the stiffness in his shoulders. A weary mother would cradle her hands in the water, watching ripples form around her fingers. No one spoke about sin. No one mentioned fear. They simply sat there, floating in the warmth, letting the ancient struggle between water and belief fade softly into the background. And so the story of medieval bathing came to rest, not with a grand ending, but with a gentle, sleepy surrender. The fears remained, the traditions survived, and the water continued to flow, endlessly patient, endlessly mysterious, a silent companion to a world that could never quite decide whether to fear it or trust it. Change arrived slowly, like dawn creeping across a long winter field. By the 15th and 16th centuries, new ideas about health began to circulate. Physicians started reading older texts with fresher eyes. Travelers brought knowledge from distant lands where bathing was common and respected. And gradually, cautiously, the idea that water could heal more than harm returned. At first, people resisted. Old fears do not vanish quickly. But the world was shifting. Cities were growing, diseases were spreading, wars were reshaping maps, and in the middle of all this movement, the quiet belief that cleanliness might actually help the body began to grow roots. Some noble families installed private bathing rooms, small chambers lined with stone or tiles. Merchants imported fragrant soaps from the Mediterranean. Physicians recommended warm water mixed with herbs, claiming it calmed the heart and cleared the blood. Slowly, steam returned to rooms where it had long been absent, and instead of fear, people began to welcome it once more. Bathhouses reopened in some towns, not as dens of sin, but as places of healing and rest. The old superstitions faded as new knowledge spread. Rivers became less suspicious. Wells were cleaned. Rainwater was collected with greater care. Europe did not change in one night, or one decade, or even one century. But something gentle shifted in the collective mind. Water became water again, a simple element, a simple comfort, a simple part of life that had been misunderstood for far too long. And in the quiet corners of history, the old fears grew distant, drifting away like steam dissolving into the morning air, leaving behind only stories, lessons, and the soft memory of a world that once feared the very thing that kept it alive. As the 16th century unfolded, the medieval anxiety around water persisted quietly, almost invisibly, shaping the habits of ordinary people. In towns, rivers and wells remained essential, yet contact with them was carefully controlled. Washing was not avoided entirely, but it was performed with deliberation. Children were still washed more frequently than adults, yet even their routines were modest and brief. Most families relied on small basins, warmed over the hearth, pouring water slowly rather than immersing the body. This was not negligence, it was a cautious adaptation to a worldview that balanced practical needs with moral and medical considerations. Medical writers continued to advise restraint. Baths were permitted only under carefully prescribed conditions, not immediately after a meal, not in cold weather, not after exertion, and preferably in the presence of trusted attendants. These instructions, sometimes contradictory, reinforced the idea that water could be dangerous. Even noble households followed them, bathing with ceremony and care rather than with frequency. Herbs and fragrant oils softened the edges of fear, masking the smells and calming the imagination, but they could not remove the sense that water itself carried unseen threats. In some regions, particularly in Central and Northern Europe, communal bathhouses survived, though they were fewer and heavily regulated. Local authorities monitored access, imposed gender segregation, and limited hours. Bathhouse proprietors advertised therapeutic benefits, emphasizing health rather than leisure, in order to counter suspicion. Despite these measures, moralists and clergy often denounced bathhouses as centers of temptation, asserting that idle conversation, physical exposure, and excessive relaxation could provoke sin. The public absorbed these warnings with quiet resignation, acknowledging that water was useful, necessary, and yet to be approached cautiously. Even as the Renaissance began, with its new ideas, trade, and architecture, the medieval habits around bathing persisted stubbornly in many households. Water was essential for cooking, cleaning, and drinking, but its role in personal hygiene remained limited. People relied heavily on linen undergarments, frequent changes of clothing, rubbing with cloths, and aromatic powders. This system provided a sense of cleanliness without ever demanding full immersion. In practice, water became a secondary tool rather than a primary method of bodily care. The persistence of caution can be observed in travel accounts and diaries. Travelers noted that baths were rare, that water was often lukewarm or cold, and that families approached washing with deliberation. Inns might offer small tubs, yet guests entered them reluctantly, aware of the effort involved in heating the water and the perceived risks of illness. Stories circulated of those who became sick after bathing, reinforcing communal caution. Fear was woven into practice so completely that even generations born after major plagues maintained these habits with little question. The symbolic use of water continued alongside practical adaptation. Pilgrims sought holy springs, carrying vials of sacred water to purify their homes or heal the sick. Religious festivals incorporated sprinklings, blessings, and processions that emphasized water's spiritual significance rather than its hygienic function. Water, therefore, existed in medieval life as both essential and dangerous, ordinary and extraordinary, practical and symbolic. People navigated these contradictions with quiet care, creating routines that felt protective and culturally coherent. By the late 16th century, bathing in Europe remained infrequent, limited, and ritualized. It survived at the edges of life, in monasteries, noble houses, hot springs, and occasional towns with preserved bathhouses, but had never returned to the ubiquity of Roman times. Cloth, linen, herbs, and ritual maintained the sense of hygiene. Water, though essential for survival, remained something approached with wariness, a reminder that the body was fragile, the world unpredictable, and tradition powerful. Medical theory continued to dominate perceptions of bathing. Physicians advised caution based on the balance of humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Baths could soothe or unbalance the body, depending on weather, temperament, and timing. Hot baths were thought to open pores and weaken defenses, while cold baths risked chills and fever. Each person had to calculate exposure carefully. Even nobles followed these instructions meticulously. When misfortunes or illnesses occurred, bathing was frequently blamed, reinforcing the idea that water itself could be dangerous. In towns where public bathhouses survived, moral anxiety shaped their operation. Clerics warned against mingling of men and women, excessive pleasure, and indulgence. City authorities regulated hours, segregated spaces by gender, and sometimes required attendants to supervise. Bathhouses became semi-medical establishments, advertising therapeutic baths with herbs or heated stones. They survived, but the social vibrancy that characterized earlier communal bathing had diminished. Patrons entered cautiously, aware that indulgence could lead to gossip, moral censure, or disease. Water retained spiritual significance. Holy water marked church entrances, blessed rivers, and sacred springs. Pilgrims traveled to collect vials of holy water for healing or protection. Religious ritual reinforced water's power while maintaining distance from physical bathing. The symbolic use of water became more prominent than physical immersion, highlighting a tension between spirituality and hygiene. Spiritual purity replaced bodily cleansing in moral discourse. In noble households, bathing remained possible, though infrequent. Servants heated water, filled wooden tubs, and added herbs or flowers. Bathing was private, supervised, and ceremonial. Nobles bathed for relief, appearance, or comfort, not daily cleanliness. Wealth allowed safety through control of temperature, water quality, and supervision, demonstrating a separation between classes in hygiene practices. Seasonal and regional variations. Climate shaped bathing routines. Winter discouraged immersion. Summer encouraged occasional river baths. Northern and alpine regions preserved steam bath traditions resembling saunas, which continued for centuries. Bathing in these areas was tolerated and even expected in small communities. Meanwhile, southern and urban regions grew more cautious. Seasonal variation emphasized water's unpredictability as a medium for both health and risk. Travelers encountered variable water practices. Inns sometimes offered baths, yet these were small, cold, or unclean. Pilgrims bathed at holy springs for healing or spiritual purposes. Water on journeys remained functional rather than recreational. Fear of disease and exposure guided the cautious use of immersion. Travelers learned to balance necessity, comfort, and the perceived dangers of water with experience. Part 19. The decline of public bathing. By the late 15th century, public bathhouses in most towns had declined sharply. Regulation, moral suspicion, and disease fears drove closures. Bathing shifted into private spaces or ceased entirely. Cloth, linen, perfumes, and herbal powders replaced water for most hygiene needs. Public bathing, once communal, became a memory preserved in stories, illustrations, and scattered surviving establishments. Part 20. Water as symbol and risk. Water in the medieval imagination remained double-edged, life-giving yet dangerous. Rivers, wells, and hot springs were essential yet feared. Immersion was optional, limited, and cautious. The moral, medical, and spiritual dimensions of water shaped behavior across centuries. By the end of this period, bathing survived only in pockets: monasteries, noble houses, sacred springs, and northern steam traditions. For most, water was a practical resource, cautiously approached, while cleanliness was achieved through indirect means: linen, rubbing, and herbs. The medieval world, slow and deliberate, navigated water carefully, balancing survival, morality, and health across generations.